I would like to welcome all of you to the digital launch of PICS, Personal Paradigms. To begin with, I would like to thank all our contributors that are artists, interviewees, and text writers, authors, for their contributions and for coming together quite collectively to bring this issue out with us, the PICS team. I would also like to thank, of course, our supporter, the Murthy Nayak Foundation, as well as Serendipity Arts Foundation, for making it part of their online festival today, April 30th, which is the last day of the festival. I'd like to briefly introduce our guests who will be speaking in the main today. That's Rajyashri Goody, whose work in the PICS issue is titled Eat with Great Delight, and who has a background in visual anthropology. Welcome. Kannagi Khanna, who has contributed a series by the name of Bagicha, and I believe part of this was shown or featured as part of Focus Scotland in Glasgow. And she completed her master's in gender studies from SOAS quite recently. And Professor, of course, Sabeena Gadihoke, AJK, MCRC, Jamia Millia, a lot of you who are viewing this will be a student or have been taught by her over a period of time. So welcome all to this session. I also wanted to say briefly that one of the inspirations for this publication has been an initiative by the name of the Family Camera Network that was managed or that had been initiated by Deepali Diwan, who is the Dan Mishra Curator of South Asian Art at the Royal Ontario Museum. And I recall Sabeena and I were present there when they had done this extraordinary exhibition called The Family Camera. Together with, she was joined by Thi Phu, who is a professor of English Studies at Western University, as well as now Jordash Ilapan, who is an assistant professor of feminist studies in culture and media associated with gender studies at the University of Toronto. So that became an important vector through which we started this initiative. And I think I'll only say that so much of what has gone into this issue, or the thought process that has gone into this issue, has to do, yes, with the question of image making, but also making visible certain conditions and certain histories. I think at this point of time, virtually everyone who is involved with an online initiative talks about how this biological condition, because of which we are at home, has become a political intensifier. And I think this is very important because, at least to mention yet again, because it brings us to the notion of home and belongingness once again. I think with Kannagi's work, as well as so many others in the publication, we have a kind of transgenerational reverberation that plays out. Sandria Freitag, who has also written extensively on the subject, talks about the materiality of the photograph. She talks about the importance of vision and gaze. And I think when we're looking at Dalit histories in one respect, we will be sort of looking at this question of the archive, the counter archive perhaps, and the importance of a kind of cultural politics of representation, let's call it that. One of the books that stands out for me was, of course, Sujata Gidla's Ants Among Elephants. But Sabeena, I would like to, at this point of time, give it over to you. I mean, we are in the throes of a media culture. This is something that you very much teach, and you're sort of so involved with these questions of maybe virality and iconicity. And I wonder whether the idea of the personal and the intimate can be understood through these vectors. Please.
Thanks a lot, Rahab. And I have to say that thanks very much and congratulations to the PICS team for bringing out an absolutely wonderful issue. I actually hesitate to call it an issue because I think the density of and the richness of the collection makes it probably more like a book than an issue. So congratulations to all of you, to all the artists, to the PICS team, to Deepali and her team. I think it's an amazing collection. I just want to say, make one or two observations about the issue or the collection as a whole, and then I will move to the work of Rajyashri and Kannagi. Um, One of the things that struck me about a lot of the work was this whole idea of a second life. You know, a lot of the work is about using historical archives, but it's about the artist reappropriating and reworking. The scholar Laura Mulvey, and I promise not to use any other names of scholars after this, she has referred to this as afterwardness. You know, the whole idea of afterwardness, that you come back to memory, you return to memory, you rework memory. And it's a kind of a second life. And I think that I was struck by the idea of how much of the work was reworking family archives through the use of text, through the use of photographs, through the use of other material, through performance, you know, all kinds of ways. And I found that that was very, very interesting. Photography, as we all know it, has two parallel histories. Photography has one history, which is, you know, the subject, which is the objective, documentation, survey, you know, kind of narrative. And then there's this more subjective, personal history. And it's a history that, of course, interests all of us. And I think that this particular issue of PICS is very embedded in this history. And I'm so glad that we have come back to looking at this history, because for very long, we haven't actually looked at the personal. So I think that I really think that we need to look at that. And I think one of the questions that I would pose for this half an hour session is, what happens when the practitioner finds herself in the middle of the history that she is researching? So here are two people who are in the middle of the history that they are researching, and they are actually part of it. So, you know, I'll lay that on the table, but let me begin by talking about the absolutely wonderful, fascinating work of both the artists, Kannagi and Rajyashri. So I have to say that one of the things that I found fascinating about both projects was this kind of engagement with the sensory aspect of photography. You mentioned materiality and the whole idea of the photograph as object. You know, that's so apparent in Bagicha, you know, in Kannagi's work, because where Kannagi is looking at, you know, this whole idea of collecting the leaves, you know, when she leaves the home. And this whole idea of not just looking at the image, but looking at what are these material objects that can actually have some kind of a resonance. But the other part of the sensory experience of photography has also, so for instance, you mentioned Tifu. Tifu and Lesbeth have actually in their book Feeling Photography spoken about the whole idea of this whole personal engagement with photography that they call feeling photography, this whole idea of how photography can be felt. But there are other kinds of sensory experiences that photography is embedded in, not just the visual. So the photograph could be embedded in other kinds of sensory experiences. For instance, the experience of taste, hearing, smell. And how does one actually evoke those? I mean, we are constantly doing that with students to say, okay, so you're talking about the visual. How does the visual evoke this sense of other kinds of sensory experiences? And I think that's where Rajyashri's work comes in, you know, to talk about this whole, the entire erotics of food, which is, and her work is very political, but it's also very embedded in the pleasures and the erotics of eating and the joy of eating and the erotics of food. I'm just trying to, quickly look at my computer to make sure that I'm not missing out on something. I have to say that Kannagi, your project brought many memories. It triggered many memories for me, because last year we actually sold a family home. And like your mother, my mother had planted 2 trees in front of the house. One of them was a gulmohar tree and the other was a neem tree. And one of our big preoccupations was, are the trees going to get cut down? And it's interesting that the last photograph that my 2 brothers and I took the day we handed over the papers to the person who was buying the house was to take a photograph under that tree. And ever since then, we often revisit that area because it's in the old part of Gurgaon for my mother's bank. And one of the must-stop things we do is to go to the old house and to see whether the tree has been cut down. And of course, I have to say, I'm happy to say that the tree has not been cut down, but we always wonder whether the tree will be cut down. Coming back, I think that the idea of staging is very interesting in your work. And I would want you to talk a little bit more about this after a while. I mean, when we get into the conversation, because this is not just work where you've documented those family photographs, but you've actually kind of restaged the work by picking up those leaves and restaging them. So I'm hoping that you will actually talk about that. In the case of Rajyashri, I'm intrigued by the way that you are addressing a history of marginalization and a kind of a blind spot in a kind of a history of oppression, a continued oppression in the past and a continuing oppression today. You know, we are looking at a community that continues to be oppressed. So it's not like we're looking at a history of marginalization, both in the past and in the present. But it's a way in which you're doing it through the family, which is very different from the kind of documentary work that one has seen. And I'm thinking here about Sudharak Always' work. I'm thinking about Arun Vijay's work. I'm thinking about, let's say, the Nepal, work. It's a different. So and I think to start the conversation, I think what I would say is, how does it make a difference when you are embedded within that work? And it's not you looking at somebody else, but this is about yourself and it's about your own family. And how important is the family and the community when it comes to looking at Dalit history? Is it possible to separate the family and the community? Does the outside inevitably spill into the inside? So maybe I thought that, because I realize we're already at 6:15, maybe now I'm going to hand over to you. I have some more questions, but I would want you both to speak a little bit about your work. Maybe a little bit of initial, discussion about what you envisaged your work. Kannagi, I have a question. Why Polaroid? So, why don't you start talking and then maybe we can take this conversation further.
Sure. So, you're lucky that the trees are still there. For me, that's not the case, really. They've all been chopped off. And I have revisited the space and it's got buildings and all that now. So, but for me, this work didn't really start off as a photography project per se. It was really about the hopelessness and the desperation that I was facing at that time, when I heard that my Nana's house would be gone and with it the garden and all of it. My first reaction was, okay, I need to collect whatever I can, preserve whatever I can, take as many photos of every corner of the house. That was the first reaction. And I think if I weren't a photographer, I would have done the same thing. So that was my first reaction. And your question about the Polaroid. So yes, I collected the leaves and everything. I took a lot of photos. And the reason I chose Polaroids is because I wanted something tangible in my hand. So these were really big trees, right? I don't even know if this makes sense, but I did all sorts of research about how can we transplant the trees to another place? Is that possible? Can we uproot them? Everything. But obviously that wasn't possible. And so I just thought I need to have something in my hand. So I really needed that copy of the print instantly with me. And, that also became a sort of object really that goes into the work. If I look at the larger picture, I'm interested in how domestic spaces play out in your everyday life. It's not just about your immediate interior household. It's about the extended spaces, like the garden, the rooftop, the courtyards. What role do they play? Because North Indian homes, like my Nana's home, which is more than 50 years old, it has a garden, it has a rooftop, it has a veranda, which you don't find in today's homes as much in the cities. But so I'm really interested in how these extended spaces play out in everyday life, and how the family engages with it, and what is the role really of these spaces. For example, my Nana would in the evening step out with a cigarette in his hand and just take a walk, and that was his private time. It was a moment that he enjoyed away from the household and the chaos inside. And you knew that he wants to be alone and he's taking a walk, and it became a private space for him. For my aunt, for example, it became a space of transgression because she would call her boyfriend late at night, after 12 when everyone's sleeping. So that in that sense, the garden was a space of transgression for her. So just the different ways in how the garden has played a part in all our lives, and it has really, it's 4 generations have enjoyed that space in their own ways. So yeah.
Thanks, Kannagi. Rajyashri, do you want to go next, and then maybe we can come back?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the photographs really began as an extension of writing and compiling these recipe books that I do, based on Dalit autobiographies. And I guess it was in my practice, I'm really interested in how one would represent themselves rather than somebody else speaking for you. How do you speak about yourself, and how do you have access to resources that will allow you to speak for yourself? So in terms of access, there's writing, so access to literacy, and then I also started thinking of the camera that way, of being a tool that was quite expensive and not really available for many communities.
Right.
Actually, I was part of like a panel on archives a long time ago. This was before I started working on the photographs, and I, like everybody else on the panels, was really speaking about family archives, and I started thinking, wow, that there's only sort of one kind of representation of Indian family archives, it looks like, because these people had access to cameras for a very long time. And so as a part of it, I started looking at my own family photographs and feeling a sense of like both personal and community responsibility of representing my own family as they are, as also part of larger Dalit history and discourse, without necessarily trying to play victim or trying to sort of just show one aspect of the Dalit experience.
Rajyashri, can I come in here just to ask you something? I couldn't help noticing that at some point, and that I have to say, the poetry is amazing. You know, that combination of the poetry and the images is quite amazing. But there is a point at which you, in your introduction, talk about positive in inverted commas. You say, you know, because look, I mean, when we're looking at marginalized communities, they're either victims or they're valorized and put on a pedestal. And I noticed, and I was very intrigued by the fact that you use the word positive representation in inverted commas, and then in the next sentence you changed it to, like, you removed the inverted commas. And I was wondering, like, would you like to talk about that?
I hope that wasn't a typo.
No, I don't think it was.
I think
so. I have my own reading of it, and I'll come in on that. Yeah. But please.
I think it's also part of, I think, being somebody who's putting stuff out for like public consumption, whoever the public is, that you have to sort of tempt your audience or something like that into not necessarily, oh, I am genuinely concerned, you know, like, oh, I don't want people to read these images as just as suffering people, but at the same time I understand the sort of gimmickiness of it at times, of like, oh, positive happy faces and things like that. So it is possibly part of me trying to like come to terms with like what narrative do I want to choose, and maybe I am still a bit uncomfortable with it.
No, I think you've answered my question absolutely. I think that's exactly what I was thinking about. So we've got 5 minutes more, and I've got one question each for both of you. Rajyashri, for you, I noticed that in the poem, there is a reference to eating cornflakes. And my question to you is that why, and this is maybe not to do really with the photographs, but maybe the juxtaposition of the photographs and the text, why is it important to appropriate the tools of the oppressor? So here we are talking about wanting to eat cornflakes, you know, and this whole idea of modernity. So why is that so critical? Why is that so important? And I'm thinking here about the suit of Ambedkar, you know, this whole idea of Ambedkar with the book, which has so evocatively, thankfully, come right back into circulation with all the anti-CAA protests in Jamia too. I mean, there's this huge, the sad part is all that graffiti has been wiped out now, after COVID. So a question for you there. And Kannagi, a question, and feel free to answer. Each of you could kind of overlap. Kannagi, when you look back at the past, and it's true for all of us, we look back at the past with nostalgia. The past is always rosy hued. It's always in hues of pink because it's perfect. But the past is not perfect. We know that the problem with looking back with nostalgia is that nostalgia sets a particular past in a particular moment and then it freezes it. But that's not the way the past is. I mean, so your parents could have been standing against that tree, but a fight could have broken out just after that. The kids could have, fought with each other. How does one deal with something like that when one is looking back at old photographs? And it's a struggle all of us have. Look, we all look back at the past with a certain degree of nostalgia. I'm thinking aloud because I, do the same with my own family photographs. So quick question for both of you. We've got about 4 minutes left.
Kannagi, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, I'll that's something that I've thought of also. And in fact, the same thing, that what if there was a fight that broke out just immediately after Nana Nani were, shot, photographed together. But the way, this is the first time I'm actually using family archives in a work like this. So I want to think of it as rosy pictures, and I want to actually think of it as a rosy past, to be honest. But having said that, that's not the case, of course. But I think if you're looking at family archives, they really become a point of, they become a site for production of memories and remembrance in a way, right? That's the purpose that I view them like that. For me, they're a record really of the past and the personal history and, what they say about my family and my family identity. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
With my question, with using the tools of the oppressor, I guess it's also like, who is the oppressor in this case, which is quite important. Like when we're talking about colonizers, for Dalit people, upper caste people, Savarna people are as much colonizers as and Dr. Ambedkar did take advantage of whatever access he got, which was actually specifically because the British were around. So things like tools like education, clothing, access to more money, therefore access to buying things, perhaps like technology, like cameras and things. So I think that's what I think. In another reading circle, we were reading about what is mental colonization, and this is probably linked, but yeah, I think it forces you to think about who the oppressor is, and to get dignity, to get your own self-respect, whose side are you going to take here? It's a very sort of thin line of difference between them sometimes.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it's something that I have often thought about, with the kind of ridicule that Mayawati had to face, for instance, with her handbags, because this whole attack on her for using a handbag, why should she not use a handbag? And this very thin line between being primitive and then being modern. And why should there have to be this distinction between, why should people have to choose? So I think you're spot on there. And I think that's really wonderful to hear that.
So really good to see both of you, because Kannagi, I've known you for like such a long time, since you've exhibited a work about your grandfather sort of dealing with the idea of memory and sort of his aspiration, and then to sort of see this work as an afterlife of even that work. And Rajyashri, we've never really met, so this is kind of the first meeting, but sort of we've engaged with the work before as well. And I was sort of had one question to both of you, and to Rajyashri first, that sort of carrying on from what Sabeena was saying about this positive portrayal, and you sort of mentioned that of course, there's a sea of images showing the Dalit community as being oppressed. And so, to have a sort of a parallel history, they don't have to be mutually exclusive, but another history that exists. What I found really interesting was that you weave the oppression, though, through the poetry recipes in so many ways, in terms of, you also talk about the oppression of the stomach and oppression of hunger, guilt, and how those sort of things also come in. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how you use sort of food to make these statements about oppression, and sort of like where food actually takes you, because food is also a space for like the family to come together and the community to come together, but you use that as a tool to sort of cite this like long history of oppression.
Yeah. I guess that's exactly why, because food is part of everybody's everyday life, and caste is very much controlled through very sort of basic rights as such, like not marrying someone from another caste, and also not having access to food materials, in terms of you can't necessarily grow your food that easily. You might not have land, you might not be paid, so then you have to rely on leftovers given to you as payment. So there were all these caste-based practices that grew out from sort of not allowing access to eating, to food. And so that's sort of why I got very interested in it, especially when I read there's a book called Isn't This Plate Indian, which is a study done by the women's studies group in Pune University. And from there, I really started looking at Dalit autobiographies, not simply as autobiographies, but perhaps as cookbooks in themselves, and as geography books, as history books. Also because we don't really have many Dalit cookbooks. We don't really have enough writing that's just spread everywhere, as compared to perhaps Black history discourse. And whereas there's much more material accessible. So that's sort of why I began with autobiographies, and just looking at how full they were of mentions of food. And slowly through that, I started reading my own family photographs, quite like books in themselves, perhaps. Sort of just like, okay, this could just be one of these poems, but it's an image.
Yeah, they work beautifully together, definitely. Philippe, do you want to ask a question, or?
I mean, no, go ahead. If you had another question.
Yeah, I just had a sort of a comment on Kannagi's work, and how it's transgenerational, but you also can't really locate it in a particular time, because when you're sort of looking at the images, it's your Nana Nani posing in front of the trees, but it may as well have been your mother. And somebody swinging, it's like, somebody sitting next to a dog. Is that you? Is that your mother? The bougainvillea that you talk about in the picture appears like there's a petal that appears in a photograph, and so like something that would have wilted becomes immortalized. And so there's like a future also somehow in the work, also in terms of, like, I saw that this leaf will exist for a much longer period of time, and maybe had the house been still there, that leaf would not have been sort of immortalized in that way. So I sort of saw it as like a work as in a movement in time, from like a past that existed before the moment of the house being sold, and sort of a future in some way as well. So, did you kind of think about it in some sort of like, where does time kind of play into the whole thing?
I didn't think about it, but it's very nicely put, and thank you for the comment. Especially the bougainvillea and how you saw it in a photo. And but for me, like I said, I mean, I don't know how to put this, but you're right. I mean, you know, the photo of it's my mother sitting with the dog. And obviously, even the photo of my Nana and Nani, you can't really make out if it's her or if it's my mother. And, you know, I resemble a lot. I look a lot like my Nani. So if I actually pose like that in the same way, you wouldn't be able to guess whether it's her or me. That is the kind of similarity that there is. So, yeah, I think it does link somewhere. And the photos that I mean, the flowers and the leaves that I've collected, I've also photographed them. So they're going to live forever, really, because they're in photos, right? So it's not, even if I misplace the actual leaf, the photo's always going to be there with me. So
yeah, I really enjoyed that part of it.
thank you.
No, I mean, I think I just had some ideas after listening to all of you regarding the idea primarily of the archive. I think Rajyashri spoke about the concept of a counter archive also, like having seen like what we have expectations about, like what family photographs can be. So I'm also wondering, like I'm very interested in what is the limit of the archive, and also what is worth being archived versus what is not archived. So that's one thought I had. And also, I mean, just overall about the issue, I think I'm wondering if we're not living also through a historical time where like people are revisiting these old photographs and find like some nostalgia also because of precious they are. But I'm wondering what it will be in about like 10, 20 years when the next generation will be like browsing to you know, this accumulation of like thousands of digital image. And so I think there's something very specific to our time also that that we are going through right now by going back to these photo albums. Like I don't know what I mean, poor next generations will have to go through like these like endless feeds of like digital images. I don't know. I don't think the experience will be the same for sure. And I wonder like if we won't be replaced in that sense by algorithm. I mean, I think it asks a lot of questions also about like the technological moment we are going through. And well, it's interesting to discuss about that like on this platform at this moment. But yeah, I mean, that's about it. I mean, just yeah, to conclude, one last thought is maybe because there's also like quite an interesting gesture of like making these albums public. I think, I mean, the title of the issue is like personal paradigms, and it's not like obvious that you will make like a family album, like you will put it in the public realm. And that's where maybe like there's a photographer's like specific gesture to that, you know. And like also Kannagi, you were saying like, I wouldn't have done this project though if I was not a photographer. So in that sense, it's interesting. Like maybe you would have taken the photographs, but maybe you wouldn't have shared it like with the wider audience.
Yeah.
So I think it's, I mean, in both of your cases, also you're kind of making an album like for maybe a wider community, but it's yeah, it's something we can all look at in that sense. I find that shift from the personal to the public, like that question, quite interesting.
Rajyashri, with your work, I was really curious in terms of sort of the reception within the community. So something that we've been seeing is like, you know, Gidla's book was something that first came out as sort of like this international voice of like what it is to escape a caste system. And then later sort of Yashika Dutt's book, like a younger writer, reflecting on her own background, which might have been different from Gidla's. And there were many criticisms, but also like, you know, in terms of, it was interesting to see how the Dalit voice also had heterogeneity, because we assume it to be one homogeneous voice, right? Like all Dalits stand for one thing and they fight for one thing, whereas, and which is not true. And so because there's also elements of class and access, like access to a camera, your father also being English, probably, you know, sort of Yashika that talks about like how her father was a bureaucrat, and so they had the access to be able to escape certain systems. So how sort of that, you know, I'm sure you've thought about this, and what's been the reception by Dalits and within the community of the work? Yeah, I was interested in sort of knowing about that.
Yeah, I've been very interested in that aspect myself, and this work was shown in Dubai in September, and there's a huge number of Ambedkarite Buddhists living in Dubai, who I met as well, and some came to the show as well. And I think it, like, on one level, I don't think it's necessarily that interesting for Dalit communities themselves to just see family photographs. Like, it's just a normal, regular thing. And I really, like, for me, it is that sort of, I'm part of this, but I'm also not part of it because of my mixed heritage and background, and also, like, art circles necessarily don't have many Dalit voices. So I think it's a bit of like trying to juggle and weave through both aspects of it. But at the same time, also speaking to people from Dalit communities, including my own family, including friends, about how, like, every single thing that we do could be part of a larger community struggle. And also giving yourself that respect, giving yourself, allowing yourself to feel that way, that maybe you're just taking a selfie in your phone, but you know that's going to end up like Philippe said, in some sort of archive in 10 years ago with a hashtag, and maybe it won't say hashtag Dalit Lives Matter, but it'll just be a regular selfie of somebody being happy. And I think these sort of minute little details do matter for me. Yeah. And I mean, exactly, at the same time, it might not be that interesting to people who are part of it already. That's okay.
Yeah, for it not to be some grandiose gesture.
Yeah, exactly. It's not. Yeah.
Great.
Sabeena, I think you.
Yeah.
you
Just quick responses to Philippe and what he said, because I've been thinking about what he said. One, this whole idea of how does the archive change with the digital? And I do think that what will change, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we will be, now we will move into the algorithm, and I think we still have to think about what's going to happen to the personal photograph. I still think that the idea of the archive will not go away. The personal archive will not go away. What perhaps will happen is, I said, virality will take over. And there will be a way in which family albums of photographs, there was a moment when photographs stayed within the realm of the family album. Today they will travel, or today they travel on the internet. And there will be multiple lives of these photographs that one cannot control. Like you said, a hashtag for the future. So just a thought. The second point that you made was about, Philippe, you said two things, and I'm trying to think, and my train of thought is suddenly gone now. Something about the archive.
From the personal to the public, maybe?
No, not
like
the
the question about the concept of like what is archived versus what is not archived, and
yes,
what is
absolutely. I don't think that, Philippe, I'm sure we all agree on that I don't think that personal archives are as much about what is left out than what is in. You know, there is no getting away from that it is about those shadows, those bits that don't make it to those photographs. That personal archives are very much about that. They are about those narratives that don't make it to the photograph. You know, Azule has spoken about all those events that don't make it to the picture, but we know that. I mean, we know that from our own histories that, that there will always be those things, those dark secrets, those things that don't make it to the album, that don't make it to our personal archives, that are very much a part of personal archives. And so any kind of work on personal archives would have to take that into account.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure then about the usage of the word archive for these personal memorabilia also.
Collections, yeah, collections.
Yeah, because I think what I was considering also is the larger archive, like for the community also.
Yes.
And whether these personal testimonies and photographs will make it to the collective narrative, basically, or not, and for what reasons, and what are the filters behind that.
That's about all we have time for right now. But thank you everyone for coming in and sharing your ideas. One of the things or notions maybe one can be left with is precisely taking on from the last point, what is going to be the place of these various objects in time? And I suppose one of the ideas is to think about a kind of revisionist augmentation of material, where it goes with the passage of time and whether classificatory strands need to actually be added to them. One of the things that we can also think about maybe when we're thinking of personal paradigms is whether the theme of surveillance comes into play after all. I mean, and we, as Sabeena mentioned, is in the throes of virality. But those experiences, I think, of us having to justify ourselves as legitimate citizens of a place or residents of a place have now come so much into question, where this whole notion of the home has become, I think, at the heart of other ideas of displacement and exile. And maybe one can think about, a kind of new settlement in a new kind of world that we want to make through these collections that we're building with the passage of time, or through these issues that might come out. I want to highlight in this gathering that we also have Zainab Mufti, who is sitting right there. And she has contributed an article after a conversation with Anusha Yadav on the Indian Memory Project and sort of the place of that. So if we're thinking of online, we have to sort of bring that into consideration as well. We have Anisha Baid, who was our administrator, who's also contributed an article on the idea of the home screen, and of course, a legacy of the computer and the vectorized world that exists. And of course, we also have a piece in the issue by Philippe Kalia, who had done a kind of survey and research around the women and the family albums that existed on Bodyguard Lane in Mumbai. So that and much, much more is in the issue. We hope to have more sort of participation with the passage of time. But for now, thank you very much.